Morning. Starting the class on Project Likutei Sichos, the second Sicha of Parshas Terumah in Chelek Tezayin. That's volume 16 of Likutei Sichos, page 292. This Sicha happens to be reworked from its original form. Originally, the Rebbe said this Sicha as a mimer, as a discourse, and then it was reworked and published as a Sicha, very close to the original language in Yiddish that the Rebbe used to recite this mimer. But here we have it in the form of a Sicha with many topics and subjects that are generally discussed in Chassidus at great length are alluded to over here briefly throughout the Sicha. Start now on page 292. Der Tzivui zu nehmen Truma von Eden. The commandment to collect a Terumah, an offering from Jews, for avodas Mishkan, for the construction of the Mishkan, the sanctuary in the desert, wird übergechase dreimal in Oneb von unserer Seder. This commandment is repeated 3 times right at the beginning of our parsha, of Parshas Terumah. 3 times. First time is v'yikchu li Terumah, they shall take for me an offering. Tikchu es Terumasi, they shall take my offering. And then the third one, v'zois ha-Terumah asher tikchu, this is the offering that they should take. Zogen der Rav Chazal, our sages explain, Gimel Terumas nemru beparsha hazois, offering, Terumah was mentioned 3 times in this parsha. V'yikchu li Terumah gomer, zu Terumas ha'adonim. The first one, v'yikchu li Terumah, refers to the contribution or the offering that was collected for the creation of the sockets that were used to hold up the walls of the Mishkan. Then the next pasuk, the next verse that says that they should collect from all those who are generous of heart. Zu trumas shkalim. This refers to the offering, the collection that was taken, the half shekel collection that was taken in order to do a census and was used later to purchase animals for offerings in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Mishkan, in the temple. And the third one, where it says that this is the offering that shall be collected, refers to the contributions and the donations that the Jewish people gave for the general construction of the Mishkan, of the sanctuary. So 3 times the Torah tells us right at the beginning of this parsha that a terumah, an offering, should be collected, and each time it refers to a different collection. In the way that these 3 collections or these 3 contributions are described in the parsha, the language is different. The first 2 are only written in general terms and alluded to, without much detail. The details on the Pratim wegen sei, their details, stehen erst in später Dikas Tedris, are elaborated on in future parshas, in Parshas Kisisa and Parshas Pekudei and so on. But Terumas HaMishkan, the contribution that was collected for the construction of the Mishkan, is described in this parsha, in Parshas Terumah, the details of what they gave and what the Jewish people donated for the construction of the Mishkan is described in our parsha in great detail. Darf man verstehen? So we need to understand. Because all 3 of these collections were for the purpose of the service in the Mishkan. All 3 of them had something to do with the Mishkan. As we'll see soon, what each one represented. When afilu trumas hashkalim was mit genutzt auf kaufen der mitte karbonas atzibur, that half shekel donation that everybody gave, which is described in Parshas Kisisa, was ultimately used to purchase animals that were offered on the mizbeach, on the altar. So technically, that isn't part of the actual construction of the Mishkan, while the other 2 are. Is doch like Psaka Rambam, according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam's ruling, as the mitzvah from Binyan HaMikdash is Zayin, it blows Bayis Lashem. The reason, the purpose for the construction of the Mishkan was not just so that Hashem should have a house, nor as Zayin, Muchon Lias Makrivim Boyer Kabbanis, it should be a place ready and prepared for offerings to be brought in it. Kumtois, as their tzivui v'asilim mikdash. This means that when the Torah in our parsha commands us to make a sanctuary for God, Nehmt darum euch die Hachanas was fordern sich zu lieb aber diese Karbonis. That includes in it also all steps necessary to actually fulfill the service of the temple, which is offering karbanos, offering sacrifices on the altar. And part of this preparation, the gearing up, the building up towards being able to perform the service in the temple, includes in it also the collection, the monetary collection that was necessary in order for these communal offerings to be purchased and then offered. So that technically is also part of the service of construction, of building the Mishkan. So, because all three of these collections were directly related to the construction of the Mishkan, so why does our Parsha not describe in detail all three of these and what their collection was and what they were used for? So now we can explain that the reason the Trumas Ashkalim, these half-shekel coin collections that were collected, were not mentioned, they were not elaborated on in this parsha, since practically speaking, at the end of the day, they're not part of the actual construction of the Mishkan. It is a preparation for the service. Therefore, is nicht da in Parshas Terumah, der Ort darf zu sagen die Pratim wegen der Terumah. So perhaps we can say that our Parshas Terumah, is not the correct place to describe these in detail. Another Parsha is, because it's not actually the service, it's just part of the preparation for the service. Let's say that. Bleibt aber schwer b'negeh Terumas Adonim. But with the other donation, the donation that was used, the coins that were then used, that were welded and melted and welded into the shapes of sockets that held up the walls of the Mishkan, was ein Natel from Binyan Mishkan. These sockets were in fact part of the Mishkan. So why is there no elaborate discussion about this contribution in our parsha? So that's the question that the Rebbe begins this sikha with. Why is only one of these three donations elaborated on in this parsha? If all three are mentioned at the beginning of the parsha, then all three should have been discussed at length. In the way the Torah describes these three contributions, we find another distinction. By Trumas Adonim steht v'yikchu Truma. When discussing the contribution that was used to create the sockets, the Torah says, "V'yikchu li truma," they shall take for me an offering. By Trumas Ashkalim, when the Torah describes the contribution of the half-shekel coins, it says, "Tikchu es trumasi," you shall take my offering. And by Trumas HaMishkan, and with regards to the contribution that was used to construct the Mishkan, the Torah says, "V'zois hatruma asher tikchu," this is the offering that they shall take. Das heißt, more specifically, what is the actual difference between the way the Torah describes these three contributions? By the Ershter Truma, with regards to the first donation, Ha'adonim, when it talks about the sockets, is the Shaychus from the Truma zum Eibishten Mudgesh in a besonderen Wort, Li Truma. The donation that's being given to Hashem, that's being given to God now, the fact that it's being given to God is emphasized in a word, in a standalone word by itself. The Torah says, Li Truma, a contribution to me. By the Zweite Truma, with regards to the second contribution, Shkolim, when they donated the half-shekel coins, wird die Shaychus zum Eibishten eingeschlossen in the Wort Truma Gufa. The association and the relation that this contribution has to Hashem is bound with the word Truma itself. In Hebrew, the word is Trumasi. In English, though, it's still two separate words, but in Hebrew, it's one word, Trumasi, my contribution. But again, in the original, in the Torah, it's one word. So the contribution and the relationship to Hashem are bound together in one word. By the dritter Truma, HaMishkan, when the third contribution is mentioned, the contribution used to construct the Mishkan, there is no mention whatsoever that this is a contribution to God. The Torah says very, very plainly this is the contribution, without saying a contribution coming to me, or being given to me, or my contribution, and so on. Just as this is a, or the contribution. Fascinating statement that the medrash of our the medrash on our parsha describes. When the Torah begins describing the various donations that people gave for the Mishkan, it describes gold, silver, copper, Zogan Chazal. So our sages in the medrash explain, again, the Rebbe calls this a fascinating insight. Zahav keneged Malchus Bavel, gold corresponded to the Babylonian kingdom. Kesef keneged Malchus Madai, silver corresponded to the Median, the kingdom of Madai. And Nechoshes keneged Malchus Yavam, copper corresponds to the Greek Empire. Va'oires elim adamim keneged Malchus Edom, and the dyed ram's hides, the red ram's hides, were corresponded to the kingdom of Edom, Edom being red. Very interesting statement by the Medrash, leads us to a perplexing situation. Vasfara Kesher v'Shaychus is that zwischen the Dalet Malchus and Trumas Mishkan. What connection do these four empires, these four kingdoms, have with the donations given for the Mishkan? Adarabah, the opposite would seem to be true. The Dalet Malchus, these four empires, haben doch gebracht die Dalet Goliath, nur Churban Beis HaMikdash. They implemented the four exiles that the Jewish people found themselves in, along with the destruction of the temple. Was is the Hepech von Trumas Mishkan, which is the opposite of the purpose of these donations being given for the construction of the Mishkan. Was in Yonah is, of course, the purpose of all these donations was Va'asu li Mikdash, you shall make for me a sanctuary, Binyan v'Hakamas Beis HaMikdash, constructing and erecting Mishkan, the sanctuary, the tabernacle in the desert. So why does the Medrash tell us that these four components, these four items, general items that were donated by the Jews for the Mishkan, correspond to these four empires that led to the Jewish exiles? So now to understand, to explain all this, the Rebbe prefaces with a famous concept in Chassidus, as the Avodah Ruchnis von Va'asu li Mikdash dir lo yisbarach b'tachtonim. What's the ultimate spiritual purpose of creating the sanctuary for God? Dir lo yisbarach b'tachtonim, making a dwelling place for God in this world. So this general spiritual purpose of the Mishkan is angeteilt in drei sugim, can be divided into three categories, or amudim, pillars or foundations, as the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos. Torah, avodah, ugmilas chasadim. So we have Torah study, avodah, which generally means worship or prayer, and gemilas chasadim, acts of kindness, which is a general reference to all mitzvahs. And because this is the purpose of the Mishkan, this service of Torah, avodah gemilas chasadim, is the purpose of the Mishkan, to bring God into this world, as the drei sugim knolim hanal, sein merumas in an inyan Mishkan. Therefore, we understand that these three types of service, Torah, avodah gemilas chasadim, must be alluded to in the Mishkan itself. V'yesh loymar, we can say, das is der tam pnimi for was mat genommen drei besondere Trumas. That this perhaps could be the deeper reason for there being three independent collections being taken right now. Instead of taking one general collection, let everybody donate, contribute whatever they're able to, and then later it would be divided into the various needs as time went on. Instead, the collection itself was divided into three. Because these three collections, these three independent, specific Trumas collections, correspond to these three pillars of Torah, prayer, and good deeds. Now the Rebbe will go on to explain how each one of these Trumas, each one of these collections, corresponded to one particular pillar of Torah, Avodah, or Gemilos Chasadim. The Yesod u'makar von alle inyonei avodas Hashem, the foundation and source of all aspects of our service to Hashem, of our spiritual service, is der Amud von Torah, is the pillar of Torah study. Alle Protim Madreges und Neufanim in Dinen Meibesh, and all the details and different perspectives in how we serve God, durch Mitzvos und Meisim Tovim, through performing Mitzvos and good deeds, seinen Miyused und Gebot auf Torah. Everything is founded upon Torah. We have the foundation of Torah, and that's how we know how to perform Mitzvos. Jeder Inyan von Yiddishkeit and Kiyum Mitzvos, all parts of Judaism and the observance of Mitzvos, hat sein Makar und Onei ben Torah. Everything originates in Torah. Das is Merumas in Trumas Ha'adonim. This is alluded to in the donation that was used to create the sockets. The purpose of the sockets was to hold up the walls. They were located at the bottom of the pillars that then came together to form the walls of the Mishkan, and they represented the foundation of the Mishkan. Similarly here, the Torah represents the foundation of all aspects of Judaism. The next donation was Trumas Hashkalim, the donation that was used to count the Jews. There was a census taken by counting their half-shekel coins, and later those coins were used from Velchem at Gekoivt Karbonis Tzibur. Animals for communal sacrifices were purchased through these funds. In there is their kav fun avodah. This represents worshiping God, or the service of God, as is expressed through prayer. But this is avodah sakarbanas. Generally, avodah refers to sacrifices, und tefillah sheb'makom karbanis tikrum, and by extension, prayer, which was established as on a regular basis after the Beis Hamikdash, after the temple was destroyed, to be in place of the karbanis, in place of the offerings. So this donation, this contribution, represents the form of service expressed through prayer. Und Trumas HaMishkan, and finally the third donation, which was used for the general construction of the Mishkan, was nemt darum die alle dvarim gashmim. It includes in it all of the physical material used to construct the Mishkan. Zahav, gold, kesef, silver, nechoshes, and copper, v'goymer, and so on. When Velchem gebayt the Mishkan, all these materials were then used to construct the Mishkan. Is keneged der avodah von mitzvos. This corresponds to the service of performing mitzvos. Mitzvos are performed through physical objects such as gold and so on. Was klalusam is gemilas chasadim, and a general term for all mitzvahs is acts of kindness. Kiyadua, as is well known, as gemilas chasadim is klalus mitzvahs. That whenever the Torah or the Gemara or the Mishnah refers to gemilas chasadim, to acts of kindness, it is a reference to all mitzvahs in general. In the chilukim zwischen die drei inyonei avodah now. So now that we've explained the difference between these three types of service of God, Torah, avodah, and gemilas chasadim, wird werden verstandig der tam hashinuyim anal siv beis by the gimel trumas. We will now understand why the Torah uses a different expression with regards to these three contributions that were given for the Mishkan. Der Unterschied zwischen die drei Kavin, Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasadim is. So now let's understand the general difference between these three paths in our service of Hashem, Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim, which is Torah study, prayer, and performing mitzvahs. Once we understand that difference, we'll understand the difference in the language used in the Torah as well. Torah is Veheya Etzlei Amun Shashuyim Gemer Lafonav Chemda Gnuza from the Meibishtin, V'kad Malayil Malpayim Shana. Torah is considered God's treasure. It is concealed with Hashem. In fact, Torah was created, so to speak, and existed 2,000 years before the world. Obviously, we're not talking about physical time, but Torah is 2,000 years removed from the level that we find ourselves in now in this world. Even before a Jew studies Torah, mitzvahs, not in the same way as studying the laws of how to perform mitzvahs. A mitzvah is only really relevant when there's a person who needs to observe the mitzvah. Called inyan ha-mitzvah is an anzog to a mensch. When the Torah describes various commandments, all 613 mitzvahs, they're only relevant when there's a person to receive that commandment and then to perform the mitzvahs. Torah, on the other hand, is completely removed from the world, and it is God's wisdom, it's God's pleasure, and it's something that exists even without a world. Of course, once the Torah was given to the Jewish people, it did descend to this world. And now human beings can learn Torah. Bleibt sie, Melashon Chazal, it still remains, as our sages describe, Dvarei ka'esh von Eibishter. They are words of fire. They are God's words of fire. Was wird nicht nishtanah durch dem, was wird nicht slabisch in seichel v'dibur adam. Torah doesn't change even when man starts learning it and studying it and understanding it, grasping it in his own human intellect and even in his speech. Sie bleibt chachmasish shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Torah will always remain God's wisdom, was is be'eina rechacher from the adam aloymid, and will always remain infinitely greater than the person who's studying Torah. Now, of course, we've learned in other places in Chassidus, and in fact, in last week's Sikha, in this same Chelek, we've discussed how studying Torah makes the Torah that a person learns his own. But nevertheless, Torah itself, the way it is in its original form, never changes and never really comes down completely into this world. It remains one with Hashem at all times. That's Torah. Torah is always higher than the world. Then we come to avodah, which is karbanos, tefillos, sacrifices, or prayer, is adam ki yakriv mekem. A person offers of his own. That adam is ich mekarev to meibishtin. He brings himself close to God. Kidua, as we know, as described in Likutei Torah, as karban is from lashon kiruv. The Hebrew word for offering or sacrifice is karban, and that is based on the word for coming close, kiruv. Why is a karban referred to by that name? Because it brings the person that's offering this karban close to God. Kiruv, akoiches v'chushim. He brings his own capabilities and his own feelings, his own senses to Meibishtin, to God. So that's the purpose of karbanos, of these offerings in the temple. When avodas hatfilah, now prayer was b'makom karbanos tikrum, which was established in place of, instead of these offerings in the temple, is the avodah shebalev. It is an emotional service. It's accomplished through your heart. Thus was der Adam hebt sich auf mit seiner koiches. The person elevates himself and his own capabilities to elikus, to godliness. Because as Rosh Hashanah, through prayer, your head can actually reach heavens. So you're elevating yourself through prayer. You're elevating your own heart, your emotions, to bring yourself closer to God. Now, this is accomplished through man working himself. And the extent that a person can reach, the heights that a person can reach through his prayer, depends on his limited capabilities as a human being. However high he does reach, he becomes entirely united with that level. So although he may not be reaching the highest levels of godliness and spirituality through prayer, but whatever level a person does reach based on his own capabilities and his own abilities, his own senses, his own feelings, and his own emotions, that level will become one with him. So that's Torah and prayer. Torah remains with God. Prayer is man's service, elevating himself as far up as possible. And these these two forms of service, Torah Avodah, in these two Torah Avodah is das Hadashava. These two forms of service of Torah and Avodah have a similarity. As by Zei Beide is this askus from the Adam Ha'ovid in und mit sich. That when a person is studying Torah and when a person prays, his involvement in these two forms of worship are limited to himself. Therefore, any results will only be felt within the person himself too. When studying Torah, his own intellect becomes one with the wisdom of Torah, God's wisdom. And when he's davening, when he's praying, he is the one that gets elevated to the highest levels of spirituality as far as he can reach. So your involvement in Torah and prayer only affects yourself. There is no actual involvement with physical matter. As turning those physical objects into holy objects. Transforming a physical object into an object used for a mitzvah. Fully permeated with this holy light. So through Torah, we accomplish great things. We grasp God's wisdom. Through prayer, we also accomplish greatness by elevating ourselves to the highest levels possible. But none of that has an effect on the physical world around us. Only through mitzvahs, only through the performance of mitzvahs with a physical object, does the physical world around us also become permeated with godliness. The Rebbe notes that although the sacrifices brought on the altar were physical, a physical animal was sacrificed on the altar, is das aber nicht in an Eufenas mit makriv given them geshem wie is in sein matzev. The offering was still not a sacrifice of actual physicality. Why? Because before an animal could be brought as an offering on the altar, it had to be sanctified. Das heißt, Kedusha von Lashon Havdalah. The Hebrew word for holiness or sanctity is similar, has a similar meaning as the word Havdalah, which means separation. Abscheiden, separating, und aufheben, and elevating von seiner Niederigkeit. So the animal is set aside. It's separated from all other animals in the herd. It's elevated from its original lowly status. Only then can it be brought as an offering on God's altar. So even though we're offering a physical animal, it has to go through several stages before it can actually be offered on the altar, and it has to become sanctified, it has to become holy. Das ist der Yisr in dem dritten Kav. But when it comes to the third path in serving God, Gemilos Chasadim, this third component in the three pillars of serving God, acts of kindness, which, as we said before, was his Koil Kiyum Kol HaMitzvos, it contains in it the observance of all mitzvahs. What's accomplished through this is to uftan beikir in the dover gashmi mit welchem is mekayim the mitzvah. We affect this physical object with which this mitzvah is being performed, although it retains its original form, at least outwardly, it still seems to be a lowly physical object, in sein Gashmis, in its own physical state. It becomes now an object used for a mitzvah. It becomes sanctified, it becomes holy through the physical object. It doesn't change. The object used for the mitzvah remains a physical object, and if you look at it on the surface, outwardly, you don't see that it was used for a mitzvah, but inside, it becomes permeated with this holiness associated with the mitzvah. That's why mitzvahs are actually limited. There's no infinite amount of mitzvahs that we have to do. Unlike Torah, which is described as being infinite. Und Tefillah was ihr Tachlis Hashleimus, and or davening prayer, which, as we said earlier, its purpose is when we elevate ourselves to heavens. Which is alluded to in the service of God, as described in the Shema, as being with all of your faculties from Mesiras Nefesh, which leads all the way to potentially self-sacrifice, giving up your own life. So Torah is infinite. Prayer could potentially be infinite. Hecher from Medidas Vagbalas, beyond all limitations. As mitzvahs seinen angetan in Dvarim Tachtenim Gashmim, but mitzvahs are not infinite because they are enclosed. They depend on lowly physical objects. Even mitzvahs that depend on our emotions, which perhaps are slightly more spiritual, darf man mekayim sein an Eufen, as der Leva Gashmi soll nicht spoil werden, mit der Gefühl von Ave v'yira. Even these emotional mitzvahs, like loving God and fearing God, and so on, require the physical heart to be affected. When you have real love for God, when you have real fear of God, your body is naturally going to feel it. And that's how you know you've performed the mitzvah properly. When the physicality of your heart and of your body, in the basar alev, the actual physical matter of your heart feels the performance of the mitzvah. Therefore, because they depend on the physicality of the object or the heart performing the mitzvah, they are limited. They're not infinite like Torah and mitzvahs, Torah and prayer. So now we come back to the distinct expressions of Terumah, the way they relate to God. Mentioned earlier, the Torah describes the 3 different Terumahs, each one in a unique fashion. V'yikchuli Terumah, when the Torah says that they shall take from me a Terumah, is Miramaz of Kava Torah Kanal. As we said, that refers to Torah. That's why the Torah says they shall take for me an offering. Not they shall give me an offering. As der Adam milamate git lahamayel. It's not that God, that man below is giving something to God, to the level of God, kvayachol, so to speak. Nor vayikchu, rather they shall take. We're not giving, we're taking. That Adam lamata nem das was megita milmayla. Man below, in this lowly physical world, takes that which is given to him from above. What's being given to him from above? Them li, the me, the I. You're actually taking God, kvayachol, so to speak. Through Torah study, you're reaching up and you're bringing God down. While the avodah from Torah is nit b'derech milmata l'mayla. Torah is not accomplished through Torah does not originate below and then reach above. Nor b'derech milmayla l'mata. As we know, Torah originates above and then it needs to be brought down and can only then affect the world below. We grasp, we grab, and we draw down godliness, God's wisdom, through Torah, and that comes from above and is then drawn down below. The avodah von Torah is an anofen von vayikchu. The service of Torah study is accomplished through vayikchu, menemt. You take is mamshech, and we draw down elikos milmayla lamata. We bring godliness down from above into this world. Because Torah and God are really one entity, the fard is the pasuk b'dayik v'yikchuli. That's why the pasuk specifically says they shall take for me. The word li, the word me, over here in this pasuk refers to God's eternal essence. Through Torah study, you are able to grasp God's essence. B'lashon Chazal, as our sages state, through Torah study, you take me, myself. An expression of grasping and bringing God down into this world, God himself, God's essence, through Torah study. Conversely, is when man does bring God down into this world through his Torah study, is beikir neither ufte von adam aloyme. This is not an accomplishment of the person who's learning Torah, nor der Fahrer was der Eibishter hat sich kvayachol reingestellt in Torah. This is the only way that a person can bring God down into Torah is because God placed himself into Torah. In an oifen as Torah is dvarekesh, because Torah is still considered words of fire, God's words of fire, bleibt the hamshachas ha'atzmas kilo v'apgetragen von dem adam haloymed. Nevertheless, it still remains removed from the person who's studying Torah himself. So, although you're actually bringing down godliness, but the person who's studying Torah himself is not completely united with God, because Torah is still somewhat abstract or extremely abstract, depending on the level of Torah that you're studying. And you can never have a true, complete relationship with God only through Torah. Business can sein ametzias. Potentially, there is room for a scenario as the Torah is all you learn. That Torah, it can be studied by someone who is impure. Then it's still God's wisdom. You're still bringing down God. You're still bringing me. You're taking me down. Bringing down God's essence through Torah study. Man is infinitely removed from the lead, the I within Torah. There's no way that the Torah, in its true form and true essence, can be revealed to this individual who is in a state of impurity. That's also why the word li is separate from the word truma. They shall take for me a contribution. This alludes to the fact as their li, the the essence that is being drawn down through Torah, and the truma and the truma itself, this offering, the avodah for Torah, which is the service of man studying Torah, they're not one word, and therefore they're also not one unit. Because as we said earlier, as much as you bring Torah down into this world, it still remains removed from the person studying it. The next step, as we said earlier, was the donation given for the census and later used to purchase animals for offerings, which represents avodah, which represents offerings and prayer. When the Torah describes that terumah, that contribution, steht der Lashon terumasi, my contribution, or contribution for me, but it's one word. Now, the actual physical offering becomes elevated and is reunited with its original source in elikus, which is godliness. The same is accomplished through prayer. As we said earlier, man becomes elevated through prayer, reaching the highest levels of heaven as far as he can reach. He reaches a level where this godly light can now be revealed to him. That's why the Torah uses the word trumasi. It was weist as der Verbund von Truma, because it's one word that indicates that the truma, this avodah, this service that man is doing, and mit li and I, hamshachas alakus durch der avodah, which is the relationship with godliness that's accomplished through this service, is an arneif nikir v'niglev v'nidigish in der avodah. It is apparent, it is felt through the person performing this service. So through prayer, not only do we communicate with God, but we elevate ourselves to God. And not only do we elevate ourselves to God, but whatever level of godliness we do reach, we actually feel it. It becomes apparent in our souls, it becomes felt, and it becomes tangible through our service. Mashenkin by the dritter Terumah, but now we have the third and final contribution, Trumas Mishkan, with the contribution used to construct the Mishkan. Was is the avodah mit geshem allein wie is begashme yusei. This is a service that is accomplished not through reaching down and bringing God through Torah, not through elevating ourselves through prayer, but rather it's a service, it's a spiritual work done with the physical world itself. The way it is in its current state, in its current physical state, is the hamshachas alakos in the avodah behelam. Therefore, any godliness that is drawn down and enclosed within this service is going to be concealed. In the far state, trumostam. And that's why the Torah uses the word truma without any reference to it being a donation to God. Under Manan Befeder shows us it's Terumah Hashem without mentioning anything explicitly that it's being given to Hashem. While in der avoda is nit kentik the shaykhs HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because on the surface it is not clearly apparent that this service is related to Hashem. So we have these three levels: Torah, where we reach down and we bring God into our world. We don't have that real relationship with the Torah, with God, because it's completely beyond our capabilities to truly grasp God's wisdom. We elevate ourselves through prayer. That makes the godliness more apparent within our lives, but only to the level as far as we can reach. And the third level is mitzvahs, that brings God into this physical world, but it is so concealed that it is not ever clearly apparent that this is a spiritual service. Now it sounds like this last level of performing mitzvahs in the physical world is the lowest level. But the Torah says that although the Rebbe says now, although mitzvahs are enclosed and therefore depend on physical objects, this is where the true purpose of creation is expressed and accomplished. As we know, the purpose of creation, the reason why God created the world, was because He had a desire for a dwelling place within this lower world. The Alter Rebbe is madrish, and as the Alter Rebbe emphasizes, as das meint, God wants an actual dwelling place within this lowest world where there is no lower. In order for this to be properly and fully accomplished, in order to properly bring godliness into this world and permeate every physical part of this universe, we first need to have Torah and avodah, Torah study and prayer. Without those foundations, the drawing down of godliness and spirituality into this physical world will never be complete. So while the purpose is mitzvahs, the mitzvahs still depend on a foundation of Torah and prayer. Now, because everything that we have in our lives today, as far as our service of God, originated in the service in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary, this was also alluded to in the service performed in the Mishkan. Der Mitzvos, the Torah redt beferish in unser Parsha nor wegen Trumas Mishkan. That's why the Torah describes in detail only this last level, the contributions that were given for the physical construction of the Mishkan. Because in this last level, these physical, mundane contributions express the ultimate purpose. And the andere zwei Trumas, the other two contributions, they're mentioned only in general terms, and they're only hinted to, because part of the original plan was that these two contributions, they served only as a preparation, as an introduction to the completion of this dwelling place for God. So the parsha begins with describing three contributions. The first two are important, but they're not the ultimate. The third is the ultimate. The first two represent Torah and prayer. They're important, but the ultimate is the mitzvahs that come as a result of the introduction and the preface of Torah and prayer. And das is echt der Bier in Divrei HaMedrash, and now going back to the Medrash, which described as Zav, Kesef, gold and silver and so on, the Goymer seine connected Ad Malchus correspond to the four empires that brought the Jews into exile. Because the purpose of all these contributions, especially this final contribution that was used to construct the physical structure of the Mishkan, is the purpose is to create a dwelling place for God in this lower world, to use these physical objects to create a sanctuary for God, is the shleimus and dominion. When does this reach its perfection? When does this purpose become fully realized? Not so much when the Mishkan was constructed. In welchem hat gesehen bei einer Baser wie in See is da Hashras Hashchina in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary, and then later on in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, we saw godliness. It was a physical structure, but godliness was apparent and it was witnessed every single day. So that the ultimate purpose of God reaching the lowest levels was not fully fulfilled and fully realized in the temple, nor in the avodah b'zman hagalos, but rather, when is this fully realized? During our time of exile. When gashmis ha'olam is betokfei, the physical, mundane existence of the world remains at its full strength. Und durch der avodah zu übermachen euch dem Geshem, and now through our spiritual service within this physical world, we transform this mundane physical existence. Is a mevarer dem tachten lamata mimena. Then we reach the ultimate purpose of purifying and thus elevating even the lowest of the low. That didn't happen in the Beis HaMikdash and in the Mishkan, in the temples, because godliness was still somewhat apparent there. Not somewhat, but greatly apparent there. In our world, the way we have it today, within the exiles, which, as we said, were affected by these four empires, that's where godliness reaches the lowest level and fulfills the ultimate true purpose of creation and building the Mishkan. And that's why the Medrash says that these four materials that were donated for the construction of the Mishkan correspond to these four levels of exile, because that's where the true purpose of creation comes to realization. And when will we truly realize the advantage of our service in this world? That'll happen when Mashiach comes. That's when we will truly recognize the advantage of physical action. Now we can talk about it and we can read about it, but when will we truly see it? That's when Mashiach comes. When Mashiach comes, we will recognize that action is superior. Was der Fahre is der Mikdash was That's why the temple was constructed of inanimate objects. For the most part, the Mishkan was fully physical. It was mundane, and it was made of stone and wood and gold and silver, all inanimate objects, because the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, first in the desert and then in Jerusalem, was a taste of what will be when Mashiach comes. So that's why everything had to be completely mundane, because as an introduction, to give us a taste of what will be when Mashiach comes, when we will truly recognize the advantage of physical mundane action. Which is mevur in the Indian from Yosef and Yehuda. In other areas in Chassidus, we describe the difference between the two brothers, Yosef and Yehuda. Without getting into too much detail over here, the Rebbe just concludes the Sikha by saying, as Yehuda weist auf der Avodah von Maisa. Yehuda represents action. The word Yehuda itself on Lashon Haidah of Bittul means concession and self-nullification. V'doimim, just like an inanimate object was yesh b'bchinas habitul be'eser, it has the highest expression of nullification. An inanimate object in this world, a stone, has zero personality. It is the most nullified object in the world. That's what Yehuda represents. Our concession to God and our nullification before Hashem. When Mashiach comes, Yosef, this level of self-nullification of Yehuda will be greater and higher than the level of Yosef. And as the Navi says, David Avdi Nasi Lahem La'olam, my servant David will be their leader forever.